You are listening to the Social Science KLAI-descope. What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Social Science KLAI-descope with your host, KLAI, and again, another episode, another guest. But before we introduce the guest today, I just want to say thank you so much for listening up until this point, and be sure to follow the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And be sure to follow the socials for the podcast on Instagram at KLAI.descope or on Twitter at KMDLAI, so you don't miss a single drop of the new episodes. All right, so that's all the self-promotion that I have. Today, I have another fellow RA colleague that was a year below me, and she worked in the microeconomics function, and I'm very excited for her because she's moving on to doing her econ PhD program in the fall. We have Rachel Pomerantz today. What's up?
Hi, I'm so excited to be on the show. Long time listener, first time guest.
Long time listener, first time guest. I am so flattered that you listen to the show. And yes, I'm very excited to have you. So thank you so much for your time today. So for those of us that don't know who you are, could you do a quick intro of yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I work at the Fed currently as a research analyst. I work on the microeconomics team, and so we work on like behavioral and labor economics. I am from Charlotte, North Carolina, originally from Ohio though, and I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and then in the fall I'll be starting my PhD in economics at Harvard. So
Woo! That's very, very exciting to hear. And I do want to hear more about your experiences up until this point. But I do know that you've told me, at least in our conversations in the past, that you've done a radio show in the past. And so I'm just actually kind of curious about that. Like, what was the radio show on and what did you talk about?
I did a radio show with my friend. It was called Don't Get Us Started. And so the premise of the show was talking about things that make you say, don't get me started on this. And so we also had guests, and we would hear rants about the like random campus hot topic or philosophical musings. Frequently, because I talked a lot on the podcast, we would talk about politics and football. My co-host was also into politics, but much more into the entertainment space. A good mix of topics. I had my fair share of rants about economics.
That's very, very cool to hear. And hopefully you will feel at home on this podcast because I try to keep it as unfiltered as possible. And I think it's very valuable in some sense to share kind of the unfiltered. I mean, it's just a very easy way to kind of get to know people and get to know what they're interested in. So that's very cool to hear. So my first question for you is, how did you get into economics? Because a lot of my previous guests, as you might have heard, they've had various different, paths and ways to, get into economics. And so I just kind of want to hear about your story and your journey and economics up until this point.
Yeah, so I think that I almost fell into economics. So I've always been really interested in government and politics and public policy. Like, I was a giant West Wing nerd growing up and still am. And I think up through the first couple of years of college, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer or like just go into politics. But so I had this interest, but also I always enjoyed my math classes in high school and in college. And I was searching for the intersection of those two things. And so I had an internship in college where I worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they have a research section where economists do economic research. I wasn't in that group. I was in the markets group, which kind of does market analysis. And I liked it, but then when I would go and see what the research people were doing, I found that was really exciting, and that kind of spoke more to my interest. And I felt like that's where I found that this intersection of public policy and math, I found that in economics. And So my search process from that was, okay, so I've worked at this government institution and I like working in public service, but I want more numbers.
Hmm.
And so that's how I found the Fed internship. And then that led to the RA-ship. And now that leads to now being an RA and having applied for PhD programs. So yeah, I guess when I look back, it makes sense that economics became the thing that I was interested in. But on the other hand, it wasn't necessarily my intention, and I just kind of found it
Hmm.
along the way
Hmm. I see.
as my two interests.
Okay. So, was there kind of like a particular class that might have guided you? Because it sounded like you were very interested in the like the general topics, but a lot of, at least in my experiences, a lot of some of
Mhm.
my friends have always been like, "Oh, I thought I was interested in economics, but actually I took the first class and then I hated it or something like that." So, was there like a class for you that made you fall in love with it? Was there like a professor that you talked to that made you fall in love with it? Kind of, how did you um, get deeper into economics in some sense?
Yeah, so I did have a class like that. I took a housing markets class my sophomore year of college, and that class taught by Professor Joseph Jerko at Wharton in Penn went through kind of the main models of urban economics and housing finance and housing economics. And I think that's where it really clicked for me in terms
Hmm.
of issues that I was interested in. Because I realized, I was interested in education and health and all these different things and housing and where people live. Like when it was explained to me this way, I realized, oh, it's this one issue, housing, is at the center of all these other issues.
Hmm.
And so you kind of, it's like inherently interdisciplinary, and you kind of get to think about how it interacts with all these other different things
Hmm.
when you learn about housing.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of like types or areas of economics that I was interested in, this class definitely did it for me. And then also, just in terms of wanting to do economic research, this class inspired me for the final project. I did a little baby economics paper
Uh-huh.
that I'm very ashamed of that looking back at now. But I really liked doing that. And from there, I worked as a research assistant for that professor, and he then supervised my thesis. And so that would definitely like set me off on a path towards economic research.
Cool. And so, I guess, is it safe to say that you're interested, like at least as of right now, and very interested in kind of like the household, kind of economics, as like a potential field of study to pursue further, or are you kind of looking at other things?
Yeah, I think broadly, urban economics, public, and labor,
Hmm.
I would say is probably where I'm at. I haven't really taken a good macro class, so I don't know if I can say whether or not it's for me. So
Uh-huh.
I'm sure I'll do that once I start my PhD.
Right, right. Once you start, I guess, taking the core of the micro, the macro, the econometrics, and whatnot. But yeah, that's very cool to hear that this one professor, thank you, for, setting you on this path in some sense, right? So, I actually kind of want to move on. So, in terms of, you said that you got your internship at the CFPB, and then you got an internship at the New York Fed, and then you're full time at the New York Fed. Could you, as much as you can say, could you go into
Mhm.
kind of what are the things that you worked on at the New York Fed, or maybe highlight something that you were very interested in working on when you were at the New York Fed?
So I'm working with my economists on a paper that we received a revision on, and so it's public and whatnot, and it looks at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on inflation expectations and inflation uncertainty and disagreement. And so when I came to the Fed, if you had told me I would be mainly doing research on inflation expectations, I didn't really know what that meant, um, or what that would look like. And I really enjoyed working on this project because it's been a full immersion in all of the different steps of the research process, from picking out the right model to actually drafting a paper and working on responding to a referee's revisions or requests. And I enjoyed that because I feel like I'd had exposure before to small parts of the process.
Hmm.
But one thing I was a little bit unsure of going into my RA-ship and potentially going into graduate school was, would I enjoy doing the entire process, like going from thinking of an idea to writing it up to submitting it to going back and forth.
Hmm.
And I think getting exposure to the entire length of that process has been really fulfilling.
Hmm. Cool. And so it's cool to hear that you've been working on that project for basically the entire lifespan in some sense, and it's definitely important to figure that out before you commit 6 years or whatnot to doing that as like a career. Um, I think also, if I'm not mistaken, from reading the Liberty Street Economics blogs, you also work on the
Hmm.
survey of consumer expectations generally as like a, I don't know if you would call it like a policy project or whatnot. So can you tell me
Hmm.
more about like this kind of body of work? Um, yeah.
Yeah. And we've definitely written a couple of blog posts for the Liberty Street Economics blog that I was interested in. So the survey of consumer expectations, which is the main data source I work with at the Fed, is a survey that's fielded monthly by the New York Fed. And the main product of it is inflation expectations, but we also ask about a wide variety of consumer expectations like labor market and the credit market and housing actually.
Hmm.
As a side note, I feel like I sound like the data description paragraph of a paper. um, but it's actually pretty interesting because you have a survey that has such a wide range of questions that you can look at the relationship between these different kinds of questions, and you can get an insight into what people are thinking and how they think about things more so than perhaps administrative data can do. So since the pandemic, I think that we've been able to shed light on some really important topics. So, for example, we did a blog post on the impact of COVID on families with children, and showing, at least from our estimates, the percentage of people who have children who are food insecure or insecure with respect to their household budget with other things. And I think that has been obviously sobering,
Hmm.
and I think it helps to ground the work we do
Hmm.
in this is how this horrible pandemic is like really affecting people's lives. And I think broadly that's what I'm most interested in about economics, is not maybe a more abstract, like figuring out the optimal standard errors or that kind of thing, but there are really important questions that affect a lot of people. And I think that economics has a lot of great tools to provide timely and trackable answers.
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually a wonderful segue into what I wanted, like the meat of this episode to be, is talking about the intersection between policy and economics. I'm actually kind of curious in terms of your motivations for doing the PhD and even beyond the PhD. What kind of jobs or roles are you looking for
Mhm.
when with your interest in policy and economics?
Well, I hope this isn't played back in 6 years, and I'm held to this.
No, no, not at
Um,
all.
but I I think that I'd go into the PhD with a good deal of uncertainty, and that's kind of the point. I think if I knew all the answers, A, about economics and B, about my career, then going back to school for 6 years would be a little silly to do.
Hmm.
Um, I I think I could very easily see myself in an academic job or in a more policy oriented job. I could see myself doing either path. I think what's most important to me is like the content of the questions I'm trying to ask. And obviously that's one of the big appeals of academia is that you you have the freedom to pursue interesting questions and you can define what's interesting. And so I would I think I'm definitely open to both paths.
Hmm.
And I think at the Fed, it's been interesting to see economists who, because I think the Fed is a little different in that it's like an academic setting, and the economists I work with are pretty active researchers. So it's kind of like a little bit of the best of both worlds
Hmm.
for them. So, and then on the other hand, I think that there are economists in academia who are very involved with policy stuff that, for example, the economists that Elizabeth Warren work with helping to like craft her tax plan or the tax proposals. And so I think that the job doesn't necessarily define how active you are in engaging with like public policy.
How do we make kind of the discussion of economics and policy relevant for public debate?
Hmm.
Like how do we bring it up to maybe an average person, or how do we maybe bring it up, in a very casual setting? Because it is important. It's a part of our everyday life, right? But
Yeah,
how we go about talking about it is very difficult.
I think that I think that we could do a much better job of teaching economics. And I think that that's important to that question because I think that the economics that a layperson understands is very different than the economics that someone who has studied it more thoroughly. Um, as a very basic example, economics Twitter was recently, like econ Twitter was recently ablaze about like the minimum wage debate. So there's endless research that has gone into whether or not like raising the minimum wage decreases employment. There's been a lot of papers written on that. But for the average person, they just saw the one graph and a price price floor.
Hmm.
I forgot which one it was for a second. Yeah, price floor decreases job, and that's like kind of the end of the story and how it's very simply taught in Econ 101. And so I wonder if we present economics in a way that kind of shows the breadth of questions that we could ask. And I I think a lot of people think about economics just as the stock market or like
Hmm.
Wall Street finance types, or a very conservative, and not conservative necessarily politically, but conservative in terms of a narrow way of thinking about the world.
Hmm.
And I think as I've learned more and more about economics, that's not true.
Right.
And so I think if you can only teach everyone 5 minutes about economics or one intro class about economics, I don't know if the class that we teach now um, does that well. And so I think
Hmm.
that the starting knowledge that the public has isn't very fruitful for having good
Hmm.
conversations about economics.
So how would you go about remedying this situation, right? Because is it
Hmm.
is it is it more like exposing people to research, or is it more, I don't know, redoing the curriculum based on updating these outdated models? Like, what do you think is the solution here?
Hmm. Um, so this part is not an original idea. I saw a recent article talking about the Berkeley School of Economics, and someone in the article pointed out that in a standard intro class, you spend the first 75% of the class, assuming a perfectly competitive uh, market, and then at the end you like learn what externalities are, and but it's kind of like thrown in at the end as the last section of the class. And instead of thinking about the world as perfectly competitive and without any information asymmetries, and like I think starting with a broad instead of starting with a very narrow concept of economics and then broadening it as you go along. I think perhaps at the beginning, talking about the range of questions that we could answer
Hmm.
would be helpful. Um, I also think that my like this is I guess a little bit broader than economics, but I think everyone should take a statistics class in high school. Um, I think that like calculus is seen as the class, like a pre-cal or
Hmm.
AP calculus is seen as like the class that you take by junior or senior year. And so I think for the average person, understanding some basic statistics would just help them understand news that has to do with numbers a lot better.
Hmm.
But I guess that's a little bit broader than economics.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that does sound interesting because I think my personal high school economics, at least the way the curriculum ran was you only had to take either micro or macro.
Hmm.
I ended up taking both of them, but
Hmm. Yeah.
but for some people it was like only macro, only micro. And then like you said, everyone was taking calculus instead of like statistics. So I had actually no statistic knowledge until I got to college, like my sophomore
Hmm.
year, which is like pretty late.
Hmm.
If I were to like, start, and it doesn't help either because a lot of like the early on economics is very hard to kind of understand the movements of curves and whatnot, like just from a model standpoint without kind of understanding a
Hmm.
little bit of the math. And so I think
Hmm.
that also makes it difficult. So, yeah, I don't have a perfect solution in terms of how you would fix that. But I definitely think that, at least for me, early exposure to research, how it's written, and maybe having a version where it is accessible to people, like a wider range of people, not only necessarily to like other economists. I think that's definitely something I would personally look at. Um, but yeah, I do agree with you there in terms of starting from a broader topic and then going out into a narrower topic. I think that's also a really, really cool way to do it.
And yeah, and I think that more and more researchers are including non-technical summaries with their papers.
Hmm.
And so there's a version of even if your average high schooler can't just pick up a random economics article and understand all of it, they can pick up the non-technical summary and at least understand these are the kinds of questions that economics can address.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. Shout out to the Liberty Street Economics blog. I mean, at least that's like one example I like to give for people who might not be, in the weeds with econometrics and whatnot to kind
Hmm.
of get their exposure to, finance, microeconomics, macro, whatever the topic may be. I'm actually kind of curious now to hear about your thoughts on how economics is presented in the media. I think that's a big
Hmm.
issue. Um, and a lot of that is, surrounding a policy, either fiscal policy or monetary policy. So, kind of, what is your
Hmm.
take on how, economics is being presented in the media? Is it too extreme? Is it too narrow-minded?
I think that most of the media that I see, like mainstream media, takes neoclassical economics as the assumption.
Hmm.
Um, so, like again, for example, the minimum wage question, I think that perhaps over the last couple months when it's been discussed,
Hmm.
that hasn't been as true. But in general, when you think about like the way that topic has been brought up, the way the news article goes is like, well, there's a big concern that this could risk jobs,
Hmm.
or there's been a debate in the media recently about the size of the stimulus packages and whether that's going to overheat the economy and cause inflation. And um, without commenting on like whether I think that's true or whatnot, I think that a lot of economists are like the more recent research is not suggesting that that would be true.
Are you interested in, teaching um, either college students, high schoolers, whatever may be the case in the future in economics? Because you're very passionate about making sure everyone is, economically literate and making sure that they have the correct information and not being swayed by like maybe the media in some sense. And so, um, Yeah, could you go into that?
Yeah, so I worked as a teaching assistant in college for um I think the class economics and public policy. So most of the people had to have some sort of economics beforehand, and it went into a couple like public finance and IO, industrial organization topics. And I think that was a really rewarding experience because most of the people in that class were not going into economics. It was a lot of law students, um, and I guess people, I guess they were in the business school, so I guess they were going into probably finance or some area of business. But I think teaching makes you better at the thing that you are researching almost because you have to once you have to clearly explain something to someone else that forces you to understand it better
Hmm.
yourself. And so even going through topics that I learned a couple of years before that, and so I thought I was really comfortable with having to go through it step by step, it really forces you to drill down on the fundamentals. And so I find it very personally rewarding, but I also think that it's just I like the satisfaction of helping people learn things
Hmm.
and helping people understand, like, for example, how complicated the world can be. I find that to be an compelling part of research in general.
Hmm.
And so I think helping other people learn that as well would be really exciting.
Yeah. I always enjoyed actually when this is like a very informal setting, but when someone
Hmm.
is actually always just curious about what I do, or like they ask about a
Hmm.
particular topic, and then they come to you, and I'm just always just like, oh, I'm very flattered that you think I'm an expert, and I'll do my best, and I try really hard to always explain it. But usually, if the end case is like they understand it or whatnot, then I feel very
Hmm.
happy. So I completely understand where you're coming from,
Yeah.
in
So
that regards.
though I have felt a little out of my depth since I work at the Fed, and so someone hears that and they think I'm an expert on monetary policy and macro, and I guess I probably know more than someone who wasn't an economics major, but compared to like the really smart people that I work with, I don't know that much. So I feel like I'm putting up a little bit of a false front when people hear that I work at the Fed.
Yeah, then you have to clarify like, oh, I actually work on these topics, and so I'm very good at inflation expectations, consumer expectations, etc. So, but no, yeah, I mean, I do like that, and I always admire people who love teaching in some sense. I think education is very important, and helping other people fully understand or be somewhat literate in economics is extremely
Hmm.
important.
Hmm.
So, you know, I think overall, like, it's been really cool to hear about kind of your take on, policy and economics and how you got into that space. And, you wanted to be a lawyer initially, I guess, but then, now you're looking into, or at least you're going on to pursuing a PhD in economics. I actually kind of want to segue that into kind of a more broader question and seeing if you have any advice that you could give because you're very close to that process, and I think in some
Hmm.
sense closer than a lot of my friends around my age, even though it's
Hmm.
only been a year. But what kind of advice could you give to someone who's maybe either considering economics or even considering a PhD program?
Hmm. Yeah, I needed the RA-ship, the program after I graduated college because I definitely was not ready to apply for a PhD program when I finished college, and not necessarily because I didn't have enough credentials or letters or something like that, but because I wasn't sure if I was ready to commit 6 years of my life and then kind of a much longer period of becoming an academic.
Hmm.
At that point, I think that there's a lot of hierarchy in economics, and you can get sucked in really quickly to like, oh, like what's more prestigious, and is this the best way to optimize, getting into this place? And I think you can get away from like the issues that actually drew you to this field.
Hmm.
And so I try, though I'm not necessarily always successful. Like when if I start to get distracted by that, I'll go back and I'll read a book that is I like a lot of nonfiction. So I'll read a book that's talking about a topic that I'm really excited about, or maybe like skim a paper or something that I'm excited about. And because it's not necessarily the easiest process to enter, and so I think you should only do it if you're actually really excited and passionate about it.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think the other piece of advice I would give is going in knowing that you always have options, even if since the beginning of college you knew that all you want to do in this world is get a PhD in economics. I think that while I was doing the applications and while I was waiting for decisions, it's a lot healthier to know, like, if for some reason this doesn't work out, I'm smart, I have these skills, I can do other things that would make me happy. And so that made choosing a place and putting all that effort in feel more rewarding, because I felt like I was actively choosing it, not like, oh, this is a thing I have to do in order
Hmm.
to 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 attain these certain things.
I will say, as a personal anecdote, I think I was originally, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to do the PhD. I just ended up applying because it was a path. But I think
Hmm.
for me, I got sidetracked because of, like we mentioned, the prestige, the not necessarily only prestige as well, but kind of like the whole process, the research process, and then the publications and things like that. Never really focused on like a passionate kind of question or singular subject. And so, um, I
Hmm.
think what you offered there as advice was just absolutely wonderful advice, and I think a lot of people who are kind of pondering whether they should take that next step can use that and help them decide what they want to do next. So that's very good to hear, and I'm very happy that for you at least that everything ended up working out, and wishing you all the success in the future um, for whatever you might accomplish down the line.
Well, I really appreciate that. I think that the caveat to that, though, is that there's so much randomness in I mean in all of the steps of this process. I think that you and I have both worked on recruiting for the Fed, and we've seen how many hundreds of qualified candidates there are,
Hmm.
and that there's some imperfections or randomness that lead to how we find interns and
Hmm.
current RAs,
Hmm.
and how many incredibly qualified people that apply to PhD programs, and how random it is which ones get offers at different places, and that like randomness can work out both ways, and that I think that that's why staying focused on the things that you actually really like about the field
Hmm.
is most important, because it's not it shouldn't be about like I want to get a PhD, or I want to go into economics in order to get the most prestigious thing possible. It should be, because then if you don't get that, it's it's um it's harder to deal with potentially. But
Hmm.
if it's this is an issue I really care about, and this is a question I want to study, you don't have to do that with a PhD. You can like do it through other fields where you don't have to suffer through 6 years of
Yeah,
of graduate school.
that's true. That is very true. But yes, stay passionate, stay hungry, and stay driven, and work hard. To put it in a very cliche set of terms. Do you have any kind of personal projects or projects that you're working on that you want to promote, or is there anything that we can look out for coming out in the future?
I on the one hand, I'm really excited about the transition from being an RA and working on someone else's projects to working on my own projects. On the other hand, that is a little scary. You're going from a clear set of assignments to the world is your oyster.
Right.
Um, so I have a couple ideas, but nothing that's probably going to be online too soon.
Okay. Well, in any case, even if it's, years down the line, we will all be looking out for it, and hopefully they all pan out. So, before we actually leave off, I do always like to play a game with my guests just to kind of, get to know you a little bit better, away from the work, away from the whatever professionalism, So,
Hmm.
I have a Q&A game that I like to play, and so I'm just gonna ask you a couple questions, and just answer the first answer that comes to the top of your mind, and they won't be embarrassing or anything, so you don't have to worry about that. So,
Sounds good.
what is your favorite color?
Lavender.
Lavender. Okay. What was the last thing you ate?
I had a bagel, egg and cheese.
Very New York.
Yes.
Um, what is your beverage of choice?
Is this an alcoholic beverage or just
Any
beverage in
beverage.
general?
The world is your oyster. Any beverage.
Red wine.
Red wine. Okay. Um, what is the last song you listened to?
Here I can pull it up. It was a song off of Hamilton.
Hamilton? Okay. Solid choice. Solid choice. What was the last TV show you watched?
I'm rewatching Jane the Virgin right now.
Jane the Virgin. Okay. I've seen like one or two episodes of it with a friend, and I heard I'm kind of it's a kind of unfortunate because I didn't really I wasn't that interested in it, but I heard it was really good. So maybe I will catch up on it at some time. Um, what is the last item that you purchased?
Um, I just bought a new swimsuit.
New swimsuit. Getting ready for the summertime. Loving it.
Yes.
Um, how many hours of sleep do you get on average per day?
Uh, I get 8 hours.
8 hours. Solid. Um, what is your favorite don't get me started topic that you did?
Um, so most of the show was during, like, at least the end of the show was during the lead up to the 2020 primary, and I love Elizabeth Warren to death. And whenever there would be some silly critique of her, I just could not stop myself from ranting about that.
Okay. All right.
I think the runner-up would be that I am a huge Ohio State football fan.
Okay.
And so I would not only rant about that, but my co-host was an Alabama football fan, but was like a little, but not as passionate about me. And so I would not only be ranting about college football, but like explaining it at the same time.
Ah, I see.
So that was a mainstay of our show.
Awesome. What is your favorite New York Fed RA memory?
Um, we do an annual ski trip, and so the one ski trip that I've been on was really great experience. It's the only time that I've been skiing.
Hmm.
Um, and it was actually, I think it's kind of funny because there's about 26 of us that went, and maybe only six went skiing. And
Yeah.
so of the six that went skiing, the other five were pretty experienced skiers, and then me, who was in ski school.
I see. I see. Yeah, I do remember that ski trip. I was also on that ski trip, and it was
Yeah.
I was honestly just there to not be in the city, and it was really nice that it snowed, so we could enjoy like much wider snow instead of like the gray mess that happens in New York City. So
Yeah.
awesome. And I know you are moving on to Boston. So what is one thing that you're going to miss about New York City?
Um, I, good question. So I live on the Upper West Side, and I feel like I've taken that on as a big part of my personality. And so I think all of the really good food, and I like having two different parks that are, 2 blocks from me
Hmm.
each way has been great. And so just having, yeah, I think the parks probably some combination of the parks and the food.
Okay, that's fair. Um, And yeah, those are all the Q&A game questions I had for you. Thank you so much for participating, and I got to definitely know you a bit better from that. Thank you once again so much for your time, and again, I really, really appreciated hearing about the things that you're passionate in and hearing your takes on policy and economics and your journey in economics, and wish you all the best in the future to come. And this is definitely not goodbye. You're always welcome to come back to the show and promote or rant about anything you want. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. As I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of the show and I've loved all the episodes that you've done so far. And I think that, starting something during quarantine it's such like a weird time that it's always like really impressive to be starting something new and
Yeah.
maybe even like a little bit out of your comfort zone. So, big fan, very excited to see where the show goes.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And yeah, I think a lot of it only goes up from here. So very excited for the future to come. Do you have any kind of social media that you want to plug, or any kind of just anything at all you want to plug before we leave?
I have my Twitter. It's just my name, Rachel Pomerantz, for my bad economic takes, and other random rants I can fit into a tweet.
All right. Well, I will link that in the description of the podcast episode. As always, thank you all so much for listening to an episode, and thank you, Rachel, for being on the show. And yeah, we'll just leave it off at that. Thank you so much for listening. Hope to see you all next time on the Social Science Kaleidoscope. Bye bye.